I got a chance to sit down with the famed Sanjay Gupta, Dr. Sanjay Gupta. Most of you may know him from CNN. I know him because he's a good friend of mine, and he was so nice enough to do the foreword to my book, Remember It. I have it somewhere here. Hold on. Here we go. If you haven't read this book, this is my book, Remember It. It came out, 6 years ago. Woo. It's time for a new one. Anyways, he did the foreword to my book. Really awesome because he is a neurosurgeon, knows a lot about brain health, talks a lot about Alzheimer's disease, which is really important to me. If you know my story, then you know why. But anyways, this is a conversation I had with him just a couple weeks ago. I hope you enjoy. Welcome. Here we have Sanjay Gupta, a good friend of mine. We've done a couple things together in the memory space, but you're most well known for your connections to CNN. You're a neurosurgeon at Emory. And thank you for joining me for a little interview here.
I've been looking forward to this. Thanks for having me, Nelson.
I think just for a bit of background for anybody watching this, Sanjay and I did a little episode together on CNN. This was 2017 maybe, something like that.
You're the memory guy, so I'll take your word on it.
It's funny. It's confusing now because I get so many people still. It hasn't happened recently, but once in a while, I'll be like, "Oh, I saw you in the airport on TV." And I'm just like, it's got to be the CNN thing. And usually they replayed it. But anyways, we met in Atlanta at some really pretty home, the Swan House.
Yes.
And I basically taught you a memory palace technique, and we walked around, and I taught you some presidents. Do you remember that?
Oh, yeah. No, it's funny how many years have passed, and I still, I can envision that room so clearly still, yeah. which is kind of amazing because I can't remember what I had for breakfast yesterday.
Yeah, that stuff sticks with you. But it was a memorable day. And then you also wrote my foreword to my book, Remember It. Very appreciative of that. It's my proudest kind of achievement that I can hold in my hand. So I'm very excited that you're on that. No,
it's my pleasure. I really admire the work that you do, and I think, teaching people about something that is of such big concern to them. That's one thing I think that came up even since we spoke is if you ask people about one of their greatest fears, especially as they get older, and I'm getting older, much older than you, it's memory. And so I thought that was really instructive and helpful, what we went through.
So I wanted to start with kind of your story, how your interest in the brain came about, why you decided to be a neurosurgeon in the first place, and how you ended up, as such a front media-facing person, expert in that field.
Yeah, it's I maybe like a lot of people's stories, a little bit of serendipity baked into there. But I'm a doctor. I've always been interested in healthcare. When I was doing my neurosurgery training, I got very interested in healthcare policy as well as my clinical training, and ultimately was doing a lot of writing, worked at the White House for a while, primarily on domestic policy issues and speech writing around healthcare. And I think it was the first time I sort of understood messaging in a different way, because a lot of what we do in medicine is write for peer-reviewed journals, and that was most of my life, most of my sort of academic life. Writing speeches for the president and the first lady kind of gave me a different sense of things and really learning how to do that. Ultimately, I moved to Atlanta to take a job at Emory, as you mentioned, and that's also the headquarters of CNN. They asked me, because they knew of my work at the White House, they asked if I would consider doing commentary on CNN, primarily around healthcare policy, Nelson. That was the original thing.
Interesting.
And that was August of 2001. And then 3.5 weeks after I started, 9/11 happened. And everybody's world changed. My world changed as well. And they basically said, look, we're probably not going to be doing healthcare policy for a while, but now you're a doctor working at an international news network in the midst of what is unfolding in the world. What do you think about reporting on some of that, covering some of that? And I found it really interesting. So all of a sudden I went from healthcare policy person that was going to do Sunday morning shows to anthrax, to Afghanistan, covering the wars in Iraq. And then basically every conflict and every natural disaster that's happened in the world over the last quarter century roughly, I've covered. And that's the serendipity part of it.
What is, and what was your kind of growing up? I mean, did you always know you'd be doing something medical related to the brain, or were you always fascinated with the brain, or that's kind of where you found yourself?
It's interesting. I think the answer to both those things is yes. I was always fascinated with the brain, but I didn't necessarily see myself as a brain surgeon or a brain doctor. There's nobody in my family who's a doctor, so there was no I had no context for that. I did decide I wanted to go into medicine at a pretty young age. But originally I thought I was going to go into pediatrics. That was the only doctor I really knew, my own pediatrician, and I love my pediatrician. So I thought that's what I was going to do. I did a rotation in medical school in neurosurgery, and I think that's when I really got hooked. I had family members who had dealt with brain problems, family member with Alzheimer's, family member who had had strokes. So I was fascinated by the brain in that regard, just listening to what had happened to them and how their brains had worked or not worked. But it wasn't until I really did that rotation in medical school that I got pretty hooked on it.
Yeah, and I read your book. It's been a few years since it's been out now. Keep Sharp, right?
Yeah.
When did that come out?
2021.
I was just after COVID. Okay.
Yeah.
And so, to me, those who know my story, has to do with Alzheimer's as well. My grandmother struggled with it, and that kind of set me off on this journey to improve my own memory. Had that not have happened in our family, I don't know if I'd even be sitting here talking to you about this today, which is kind of wild. So your connection to Alzheimer's is really, you've kind of seen through family members and friends the impact of that.
Yeah, I think that's a lot of it, and then certainly when you're a clinician in this area, as a neuro doctor, you do come across a lot of patients. I don't, there's no surgical sort of therapy for Alzheimer's, but there's a lot of crossover in the patients that we see, and I did neurology rotations. A lot of times patients are seen by neurologists first, so the brain is fascinating to me. It's 3.5 pounds of tissue, and it's so enigmatic. Every as you know, we talked about this, but every joy, every aspiration, every love that you've had in your life is all stored there, and that's still mystifying. But I think what is interesting from a physician standpoint is when things don't go right, when there's a problem, it oftentimes provides you tremendous insights into the brain as well. So I think that as I started to practice more and more, as I was in my training 7 years, you're just so immersed in it that every aspect of what's happening with the brain is of interest. And Alzheimer's and a few other things, but Alzheimer's in particular was a big part of that.
And so when you wrote that book, great advice in there. Well, I guess I want to ask you, what are your just because not everybody's maybe read it, but what would be your advice? We can start general advice for maintaining brain health as you age, whether that's your memory or your problem-solving skills or just your alertness, sharpness, all these things. We don't really think much about how to maintain that. We think about our bodies, what we put in our bodies, exercise and stuff, but we don't really focus on the mind. And I think that's changing now. At least that's what I've been trying to change. People like yourself as well are rewriting that relationship people have with their brain health. But what is your kind of general advice to maintain brain health?
Well, I think the top line thing that you said, I think is really important just as a starting point. I think that up until recently, within the last couple of decades, the idea that we could even address brain health, that was not something that was widely considered. Even in the medical establishment, kind of you got what you got, your brain did what it did, and that was it. It was this black box sitting in your skull. And in some ways, Nelson, I would liken it to how we thought about heart disease, going back to the middle of the last century. I think before the Framingham study, which is a famous study on heart disease, before that came out, people thought, look, my grandfather had it, his father had it, I'm going to get heart disease. That's just the way that it goes. And I think now there is a widely accepted and well sort of substantiated belief that there are things you can do to really reduce, if not eliminate, your risk of heart disease. And that's fantastic. It's still a problem in this country, but if you were diligent about actually taking care of your heart, there's a good chance you would never have a heart problem per se. You wouldn't have a heart attack. It's not preordained. That is where we're at the nascent stages of thinking the same way about the brain. So there are many things that you can do to maintain brain health. It's not preordained that you're going to just lose memory, that you're going to develop cognitive dysfunction, all these sort of things as you get older. And a lot of the same things that worked for heart health are also beneficial for the brain. As a general rule, what is good for the heart is good for the brain, but not entirely either. And that's where I spent a lot of time in the book. Like, what is it that actually constitutes brain health? By the way, I could ask you this as a memory person versus a neurologist and might get two totally different answers.
Sure.
It's probably not memory, as you well know. It's probably more your ability to have significant cognitive reserve, so that the same life events that might cripple one person could actually strengthen your brain. And I think that's a lot of what brain health is. But if you're looking at the evidence around brain health, the thing that probably has the most substantial evidence has little to do with crossword puzzles and Sudoku and things like that, and much more to do with something else you're very good at, which is physical activity. And the physical activity, there's all these mechanisms that have now been described that show you make something known as BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. As a prominent neuroscientist called it, it's sort of like the miracle grow for the brain. You can't inject it, you can't eat it, you can't supplement it, you can make it, and the best way to make it is through physical exercise, or physical movement, I should say. But what is interesting, and I think you'll find this interesting, is that with heart health, you want to get that intense activity. That seems to be the most beneficial. The problem when you do intense activity for the brain is that you're also releasing a lot of cortisol, a lot of stress hormone. And so you're making the BDNF, but you're also inhibiting the BDNF because of the stress hormone. So moderate activity ends up being better for the brain, whereas intense activity may be better for the heart. And you can find these sort of differentiations in all these different aspects of our lifestyle. When you eat a lot of sugar, for example, we know that's bad. Nobody argues with that. But the body will store that sugar as energy, as fat, because that's how the bodies are designed. But what's interesting about the brain is that if you raise the blood glucose level, after a certain point, a pretty narrow window, the receptors in the brain will just sort of shut off. It won't absorb anything, which means that you could be stuffing your body and starving your brain at the same time. So too much sugar is particularly problematic for your brain. It's why little kids have crashes when they eat too much sugar. So I'm just giving you a couple of examples, but I think the basic message is that if you continue to use your brain, if you continue to develop new neurons by being physically active in the ways that I described, and you're not damaging it through diet and other things, you're likely to be able to have a brain that lasts your lifetime. I mean, it's the one organ, I think, in the body that can actually reliably grow sharper as you get older. Is there wear and tear? Sure. I look at brains all the time. I looked at the brain of a 93-year-old guy a couple years ago who had trauma. Sharp guy. Still worked as an accountant. Was still driving. The reason that he even got injured was he was up on the roof of his house blowing leaves. I mean, 93 years old. And so when I was operating on him, part of me thought, I'm going to see a Nelson Dellis looking brain, a very young, healthy brain. And what did I see? I saw a sunken, shriveled brain that was reflective of a 93-year-old's. Yeah. But the point is that it worked really, really well still. Wow. So the brain is this one organ that can reliably stay sharp throughout your entire life. And I think some of to your question, some of the advice is these relatively simple things that we don't do.
Based on that, I mean, perhaps, again, going back to the definition of a healthy brain, it really doesn't have to do with not that we see it all the time, but the looks of the brain, right? Like maybe it doesn't even have to do with the physical properties of the brain, right?
That's right.
Which is fascinating.
Yeah, that is, I think, because we live in this sort of very tangible sort of world where we want to look at things and determine their health. With heart disease, you want to look at a blood test and say, well, this ejection fraction or cholesterol level, whatever is X. We don't have that kind of measure of the brain. So we look at it. And what we now know is that what's happening in the functioning of that brain may have little, if any, correlation with how it actually looks, which I find this fascinating still, and I've been doing this for a quarter century.
I mean, it's what you said at the beginning, that it's still so enigmatic, right?
Yes. The most enigmatic 3.5 pounds of tissue in the known universe, I would say. And that's saying something. I mean, look, we're not talking about, space travel on your show today, but look at human beings. Look at consciousness. Yeah. If you just sit back and reflect on that, it is super meta. To sort of think about that, to think about your own brain. I think about it all the time, and I haven't figured it out.
I'm gonna go a little out there, just because the last few years for me, I've had some interesting experiences with my mind, and I've played around with a few kind of out there things that I'm starting to introduce in my channel a little bit. I'm a little bit cautious because it's a bit fringe, a bit woo-woo, but a lot of it comes down to consciousness and kind of this intangible thing that we're kind of dancing around. But one of the things that's been of interest to me of late, because I train my memory so intensely and I'm very aware of my performance, say when I'm doing a memory task at high speed for a top score or to try to beat my personal best, sometimes I have this experience where I don't even feel like I'm memorizing at all. Like I'm just a bystander of my brain operating, and the information is there to be picked at. That's not always the case where it feels so flow-like, but it's similar to how maybe an athlete might consider their flow state, where they don't know what's going on. They're just shooting threes and they're falling through the hoop like it's an ocean, right? Granted, they put a lot of hours into training, and their body's kind of on automatic at that point, but they all kind of describe this state of like not even being there. It's like something else takes over. Anyway, so with relation to memory, I find that fascinating because I often wonder, is memory actually in the brain? Or is there something out there that we don't understand that we are interacting with, that our brain is interacting with in terms of writing the data, saving the data, and reading the data? I don't know. It's a bit out there. I don't know what your take on that is. I'm curious.
Well, I think I draw a little bit of a distinction between very functional aspects of the brain versus things like consciousness. I do think that while there's still a lot that we don't know about the brain, I think we've gotten a better sense of how memory works, for example. And part of that is, again, not just looking at healthy brains, but looking at what happens when people have memory abnormalities, either from disease or head injury or something like that. And you can really get, not to sound too reductionist, but you can get a real idea that this person will completely lose their short-term memory with injury to this part of their brain, to their hippocampus, for example. So I think that does lay down the argument, at least for certain types of memory, that the brain is intricately responsible for that, which is no surprise, but even that those memories are stored there. Whereas with consciousness, this idea of, you've probably heard this term, but non-local consciousness, this idea that maybe consciousness in and of itself is not stored in the brain, it's stored elsewhere in a non-local way, I think is I don't know the answer. I mean, that is, and I don't know that I'll know the answer in my lifetime, or that anybody will, but I think there's a lot about that we don't understand, and the idea that non-local consciousness is possible, I would not take that off the table. I think that is quite possible, and I think that raises lots of big questions, Nelson. Sounds like some of which you've pondered, but I think it really drives at this question of life and death. Like, what happens after you die? What happens to all of that consciousness?
That you-ness, right?
What's that?
That you-ness. What happens to
you-ness.
The thing that is you?
I think, it's funny. I was listening to an interview that Elon Musk did the other day, and he was talking about Mars. And I think one of the things that he said really stuck out to me, which is that what are we really trying to preserve here? Obviously, we're not going to preserve all of human life by starting to inhabit other planets. But it is possible that we think of consciousness as such a unique thing that sort of happened in our universe, in our world, that it is worth preserving. That we have to preserve consciousness somehow. That might not even take the form of a human body, might not even take the form of a human brain, but consciousness in and of itself has to be preserved. And if you start to think of it that way, the idea of non-local consciousness becomes, again, something that you'd keep on the table as a possibility.
That's fascinating to think about, because you're 100% right, or he's 100% right, because nobody's, 100 years from now, I'm not going to be there. You're not going to be there. Our kids probably won't be there. Obviously, future humans might be there, but what is that really? Like, what are we trying to keep or preserve there? I mean, it's a history, right, of us, the thing that is us. Yeah, wow. When I think about that,
right. I think anyone's listening, I'd have to hit pause and just consider that for a minute.
Yeah. Let's go back down to earth for a little bit.
Okay.
So I always say that with memory techniques, I'm not a doctor. I'm a practicing memory expert. I've been in the trenches. I'm doing the work and I'm seeing the results. But I'm not 80 with Alzheimer's disease yet, or I might never be. But I like to think, and I get this question all the time, will what I do or what I teach prevent Alzheimer's disease? And my answer is, I'm not 100% sure. I think there's a lot that goes into that question than just some memory techniques will prevent that. I like to think that it will play a part. And if anything, it would act like a crutch to help push back or prolong that from potentially happening. What are your thoughts on memory techniques or practicing your memory, using your memory more frequently, especially in an age where it's easy not to use your memory?
I think what I would say is that I do think of being very intentional about memory to really because I think what it can help with is memory lapses that people don't realize that they're necessarily making. They'll say that I forgot something, but it's not that they forgot. It's that they actually never remembered it. They never went through the intentional act of memory. But I think, Nelson, I might distinguish that from something like Alzheimer's disease or even other types of dementia. I think what has been so interesting is, as I've studied this for a long time, both as a physician but also as an investigative journalist, this idea, first of all, that there are places around the world where Alzheimer's dementia is very rare. Now, what is that? Why is that relevant? I don't think these are necessarily places where they're practicing memory techniques all the time.
Sure.
I think it has to do with how they're living their lives. And so is there a way to live your life that can greatly reduce your risk of developing dementia? And I think the answer to that is pretty clearly yes. In fact, some of what we've learned recently, even, there have been a few big papers that have come out about this, that with pretty intensive, so I want to be, I don't want to shortchange it, but, intensive lifestyle changes, you can dramatically reduce the chance of developing amyloid plaques in your brain, dramatically reduce the chance of you having clinical symptoms of Alzheimer's or other types of dementia. And what is interesting is when you look at some of those lifestyle changes, they're going to sound very different than what you might expect. Some of them may be obvious. A plant-based diet, for example. We know that meat leads to lots of inflammation. Inflammation can often be the precursor for these plaques, and these plaques seem to have some sort of relationship with Alzheimer's. So what you eat makes a huge difference. And in places where they have very low rates of Alzheimer's, they eat far less meat than we do. So, what is the right dose of plant-based versus meat? We don't know. But I think it's pretty clear that if you're worried about your brain, focusing on something like that makes a big difference. Here's another one, something that you won't have a problem with because you're a very fit guy. But as people get older, they often worry about their brains, but their bodies are changing as well. And one of the big ways that their bodies change is the overall makeup of their bone, their fat, and their muscle. You have a certain amount of bone, fat, and muscle in your body at any given time, a certain percentage of it, and a certain location for it. We know, for example, that if you continue to have significant amount of lean muscle in your body, you are less likely to develop dementia. So people get older, they stop lifting. They stop doing resistance training. Okay, now, I tell my parents this who are in their 80s. Some of that I get. But the idea that somehow you just accept the fact that I can no longer have muscle on my body because I've gotten older, that's not true. I mean, that 93-year-old guy I was telling you about, he was a physically fit guy. You gave him a hug, you felt like you were hugging a tree. He's 93 years old. So why do we think this way? I think it's because, we live a life of convenience and we stop using our muscles as much. So I went through a bunch of testing, and my preventive neurologist, one of the pieces of advice he gave me to maintain my brain health, okay, so this thing that I'm about to tell you was to preserve brain health, and that was to wear a rucksack now whenever I go for my brisk walks with my dogs. A rucksack. Nice. Yeah. Because we get particularly bad at developing skeletal muscle. We focus on our extremities, legs and arms, but our skeletal muscle, it starts to wither away as we get older. So can we preserve brain health? Yes. And we can do it in ways that I think are totally surprising. And I'll give you another quick one. The longest nerves in our body actually are the ones that run to our feet. You're a climber, so maybe this is something you think about quite a bit, but most people don't think about their feet very much. You wear shoes, and you're not actually stimulating the nerves in your feet very much. So he recommended 10 minutes or so of wearing toe spacers every day. There's little toe spacers. I don't know if you wear them as a mountain climber, but no. When you wear toe spacers, you're actually training your toes to act independently and stimulating those nerves in your feet, which could have an impact on your central nervous system and maybe reduce your chance of developing dementia. Wow. It's fascinating. Yeah. So yes, on the cognitive stuff. Yes, keep stimulating your brain, reading, learning new skills and all that. But when you activate your body in the ways that I'm describing, it's almost like you're telling your brain, hey man, I want to be here. Yeah. I want you to be a partner with me for my entire life. I'm not letting my body go, so you, meaning brain, don't let the brain go either. Just keep it activated. So physical activity, again, in these ways that I'm describing, may have more of an impact on brain health than just about anything else.
Going back to the different societies that have rare occurrences of dementia and Alzheimer's, where are those that you're referencing? A
lot of them correlate with these areas that Dan Buettner has written about called blue zones. Yes. So, for example, and I've visited all of them now. I'm lucky to be an investigative journalist. I can go spend time and immerse myself in these cultures. Okinawa, for example, is this one place. It's an island off the coast of Japan, and they don't even have a word for retirement over there. There is no retirement in Okinawa. Older people are actually greatly revered in society. They're the ones that sit on big boards and provide counsel for new companies that are coming up and all this sort of stuff. So they're constantly using their brains, and they're constantly active as a result of all the things that they're still involved with. I think if you go spend time with people, when I spent time there, I spent time with a guy who's 100 years old, and he was teaching me karate. And by the way, he flipped me a couple times onto my back.
A 100-year-old?
100 years old. And he's also this guy in the community that everyone knew. He started his own business, a karate studio, and he's considered this just widely revered person. When I was in Loma Linda, California, to bring it closer to home, that's another one of these blue zones. There was a guy named Wareham, Dr. Wareham, who was a cardiac surgeon, heart surgeon, performing heart surgery up until his mid-90s. Wow. And came to meet me, sit down in the town square, told me he had just finished mowing his lawn and doing some yard work around the house before he came to see me, where he drove himself, sat down. We were talking about books that we had read throughout our lives. Several times he remembered the titles of books that I myself could not remember at that time, and I was in my 40s at the time, and he was in his 90s. So, there are these places. The blue zones are a good place to look, because I think the lifestyle that people have there, many of these places don't have gyms. But people are just naturally active in the ways that I described. Yeah. They're walking to get from point A to point B. They're walking hills often to get that skeletal muscle sort of build up from point A to point B. Their diets are much better. Much of this is not going to sound surprising. We eat too much processed foods. That's a brain sort of bomb, those types of foods. So anyway, there are places like that around the world, and I think we're going to discover more and more of them.
Let's talk a little bit about your upcoming. You have a documentary coming up about Alzheimer's, right? Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah. So this is something we've been working on for about 5 years now, and what I really wanted to do was look at where we are in terms of Alzheimer's overall. I mean, for about a decade and a half, there really had been no progress on Alzheimer's in terms of new therapeutics or anything. Then over the last few years, you've gotten a bunch of new medications available, these monoclonal antibodies, lecanemab, and things like that. I really, in some ways, part of this doc wanted to tell the story of those medications, their real utility. If you have somebody in your family or yourself considering this sort of thing. But the majority of the documentary really focuses on, I think, what we're already talking about. It's this idea that we're very comfortable saying, hey, look, we can probably predict, prevent, and treat heart disease. Are we getting to that point with the brain as well? Are we at that point, where we started to get at 50, 60 years ago with the heart? Mm-hmm. And I think we are. And so I followed some of these trials, these intensive lifestyle intervention trials for several years. Spent time with patients 5 years ago, followed them again 5 years later. And these are all people who had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And as you may know, your own grandmother's experience, once you're diagnosed, your speed of trajectory may vary, but typically you're not getting better. You may get worse more slowly, but you're typically not getting better. Nelson, many of these people got better. And it wasn't just subjectively better. Hey, I feel better. They went through intensive cognitive evaluations. So we knew, hey, look, is your memory objectively better? Is your processing speed objectively better? Is your executive judgment objectively better? I myself went through this cognitive testing. And I'll tell you, I think for a lot of people, because there's not a scan or a blood test to tell you that you have cognitive dysfunction, people think this sort of testing may have little value. It's intensive. How many words can you recite right now in the next 60 seconds, starting with the letter G? And by the way, every time you pause between, you lose some points. If you say a simple word like go, you lose points. If you repeat yourself, if you don't keep saying words for the whole 60 seconds, you lose points. It's interesting, right? That's not an example of IQ. It's an example of a very specific part of cognition. If I give you 30 words and then 10 minutes later, just say, Nelson, just recite those 30 words back to me. Now you're a memory champion, so you might be able to do that. I had a challenge with it, and here's something that I learned, is that I gravitate away from remembering words that have B's and D's in them. And part of the reason I do that is because I didn't realize this, but I have dyslexia, and I was never told this until I went through this cognitive testing. Your smell. There's these huge scratch and sniff books of smell. And, you scratch it and then you sniff it. And is that gasoline or is that acetone or is that a forest fire or what? And imagine, 500 smells like this that you have to do sort of rapidly. These are sort of examples of how we can evaluate cognition. But the large point of the documentary is that whatever these tests may be, however you look at them, you can improve your scores on these things. And a lot of it is through these intensive lifestyle changes without any new medications. I met patients whose brains became lower in amyloid and tau levels, whose cognition improved, and these were people who were diagnosed with Alzheimer's. So it's incredible. Like, I think half your listeners may say, well, obviously, live a healthy life and you will reduce your chances of developing these problems. Sure. I don't know that everyone has thought about that being true with the brain, but it is. But the second part of this is that it's amazing that your brain can respond that quickly. it's almost like once you start taking care of it, it actually improves really, really fast. I don't want to suggest that anybody who has Alzheimer's out there can just start doing these things and reverse the disease. But I think what these studies show, at least in the early stages of Alzheimer's, right after the time someone is diagnosed, you could have a significant benefit from lifestyle changes that I don't think people realize the significance of.
Yeah. I'd also say, and this is harder to measure, but I've experienced this a lot by being a coach, a memory coach and teacher, is that confidence in your ability, your cognition, whether that's memory or any other cognitive skill, goes a long way, right? So when you start training your memory, you're probably like, I'm just bad at this. You're very familiar with forgetting things or feeling that feeling of forgetfulness. But then when you start to get these little inklings of like, wait, I can actually recall this, or I'm sharper, I start remembering more of my day, that almost feeds itself. So I can imagine if you're feeding your brain the right things, you're starting to feel better, you're starting to think sharper or get that feeling, and you're doing better on these tests, that just fuels it even more. I think the brain comes alive, like you said. It's in a short amount of time. I think that the thing that enhances that or speeds that up is probably that it is this, again, enigmatic blob in your head that kind of has some je ne sais quoi to it that I think can push it a little further.
I think you're totally right. And look, you're the walking embodiment of that. But because I know it didn't always come easily for you. So once you started to do this and you developed that confidence, it probably became self-perpetuating. I mean, I gotta say, just because that room at the Swan House, and you talking me through that gave me a lot of confidence, because even though I think I've been a good student my whole life and went into brain surgery, I would never say that I had outstanding memory. People say, do you have photographic memory? I'm like, no, I have to work really hard at that. But the idea that even after, those middle presidents that I would always have trouble with, McKinley, Roosevelt, Taft, Wilson, Harding, Coolidge, Hoover, me being able to do that is Nelson Dellis. And that gave me a lot of confidence, I mean, and I still, when I think of those presidents, I still think of that room and the raft for Taft, and the tennis ball for Coolidge, So for Harding, so it's fascinating to me.
When is I'm excited to see that documentary. When is that and where is that airing?
May 19th. It's gonna come out Sunday night. It'll be on CNN first, and then it'll be on Max, so you can stream it on Max as well if you have Max.
Awesome. And these are people. I mean, this has been in the works for years, right? If
we started
people 5 years ago.
Yeah, we started filming this in late 2018. To be totally candid, part of the goal at that point was to get it out sooner, but then this pandemic happened, and so we sort of took advantage of that time to say, look, we have the opportunity now to say, not just how are people doing 6 months later after these lifestyle programs, but how are they doing 5 years later? Yeah. And, look, I got parents in my 80s now, and I've got Alzheimer's in my family. I think the general sort of feeling for a lot of people is despair if they hear that they have this in their family or they've been diagnosed themselves. Yeah. That's not the case. And I think I was really inspired talking to all these researchers, which was why we decided to make a documentary about it. And now we can show people so they can see with their own eyes what happened to these folks over that 5-year period. And I think they're going to be pretty inspired by it.
Yeah, well, great messages overall. I mean, it's always encouraging for me even still, and I'm sure people watching this, that there is so much you can do for your brain. If you think you have a terrible memory, try some memory techniques. You'll see an improvement instantly.
Yeah.
You can change the way you eat. You can go out for a walk, wear a little backpack, right? Apparently, that's
get that
wild.
Skeletal muscle. Don't forget your skeletal muscle.
Yeah.
Yes.
So interesting. And clearly that there's still a lot we don't know about the brain. So obviously we'd like to know more about it, but it's also, I think, the horizons of it are exciting because who knows what we'll learn in the next 50 years.
It's really exciting. I mean, I think that I think if I had to say one thing, it's like get out of the way and let your brain sort of do its thing. You know,
Yeah.
I mean, I think we're constantly assaulting the brain with the crazy lifestyle things in our modern world. Get out of the way. I mean, you're inhabiting the brain in some ways as opposed to the brain inhabiting you. And if you just let it do its thing, it is remarkable. It is absolutely remarkable.
Great way to end that. Thank you so much, Sanjay, for being here to talk to me about brain health. And I'll share some links to some of your information where they can find you.
Yeah.
How they can reach out to you if they have questions, your book, all that in the description.
What a pleasure talking to you, Nelson. You look great. I hope you're doing as well as you look, and hope to talk to you again soon.
Thanks, man. Take it easy.
Okay, you got it.
So there you have it. Sanjay Gupta, everybody. What'd you think? Cool guy, good friend, very knowledgeable in the brain. I wish I could have talked to him for longer. I don't know. When I first started this channel, I did some longer form kind of interviews. They're not very good. Let me know if you think I should do longer form interviews like that, but even longer. You know, I had so many more questions I would have loved to ask him, but I don't typically put out that kind of content. So if you want to see more of that, let me know. Anyways, Sanjay Gupta, please check out his stuff. I'll put links in the description, but most notably, his book is great. Keep Sharp, check it out. Really great brain health tips in there. And then check out the documentary that he mentioned, which I guess at this point is now streaming on Max. I've watched it. It's phenomenal. Really eye-opening. So please give it a watch, and I'll see you in the next video. Please like, share, and subscribe. If you're not subscribed already, what the hell are you doing? What are you doing? Come on. I'm out.